Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Vienna, Austria. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist, Adam Tooze in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So we have a handful of things prepared for you all today, including a segment on Donald Trump's trade wars with China specifically, and how the Chinese economy is shaping up in relation to Trump's economic policy. But before we get to our data point, we just wanted to thank everyone who responded to our pitch last week for listener support. It is really incredibly gratifying to have listeners who are engaged and appreciative and want to make sure that Ones and Twos remains viable. If you opted in for the shout out, we will be doing that at the end of the show. We'll be doing a few names each week. And meantime, if you have not yet donated, please consider doing so. It is easy, it is quick. It's our way of keeping the show available to everyone without resorting to a paywall or limiting access to FP subscribers. We really hate that idea of restricting our listenership, but that means we need your help. So, you'll find a link in the show notes that will take you directly to the support page, and we'll thank you right here on the air if you want. Anyway, let's get back to the show. Yeah, as I mentioned, we have a segment on China and Trump, but first, as we've been doing in recent weeks, we wanted to talk about a couple things that have more recently come up in the news. The first question I have, relates to something that's so much in the news that we don't even have the precise news at hand, namely the new tariff rates set for Donald Trump's Liberation Day, so-called. Those will be announced on April 2nd, a bit later on April 2nd than we're recording. But I wanted to ask Adam about the process by which these tariffs are getting set, because it really all traces back to Trump himself, as a presidential candidate, announcing that this would be his administration's policy, and really getting into the details of it in terms of even precise rates on countries around the world that he intended to impose. And even now, in the run-up to the announcement of what those rates would be, all the news reports were about how Trump was the one apparently making the decision on these exact rates and who they would apply to. And, that seems to me a very technical thing for the president, and especially someone without economics background, to be involved in. And I'm curious how we should think about, the technical nature of trade policies that relates to this policy. I mean, it got me thinking about how, one reads in history books about, monarchs or political leaders determining specific military tactics on the battlefield, and then that oftentimes was, I guess, not a wise way to go about pursuing technical policies of that kind.
Yeah, maybe I can start just by adding my thanks to Cam's appreciation of the support we've received from our listeners, folks. It's really generous of you and much appreciated, and very much in the spirit of what we're doing here. Thank you for throwing some dollars in the tin. It's really, really much appreciated. And I hope that we go on giving you, good listening and valuable and useful content going forward. On which point, with regard to Trump and tariffs, it is insane. I mean, I'm watching the live feed from the FT, and no one appears to know when this announcement will be made, because I think otherwise we would have a timeline. We don't know when that's going to be. If this was a Fed meeting or something like that, or the release of some important piece of economic data, we would be ticking towards 8:30 in the morning or early afternoon for a press conference. We simply, I don't think at this point, even know when it's coming. And interviewed on the relevant, news stations last week, very, close advisors of the president were saying things like, I can't really give you any forward guidance on how this is going to go. I don't know. All I know is the president is talking to smart people, and so I'm sure he'll make the right decision. I mean, sycophantic stuff like that. So I do think, Cam, that analogy to a kind of early modern mode of governance is the appropriate one. In terms of battlefields, the last major moments at which monarchs were present in a significant way on the battlefield is is 19th century, mid-19th century. And at that point, they weren't really in control. General staffs were by the 1860s, 1870s. So this is an anachronism. This is a crazy. We shouldn't put lipstick on a pig here. This is a total mess. It's haphazard. It's crazy. It's unlike any tariff policy making that we've ever seen before. Your focus on technicality is an important one, because very early on in the history of American tariff making in the modern period, so in the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, creating the so-called scientific tariff was actually something that American politics set about doing, which was a deliberate process of expert estimation. It was also, of course, a mode of log rolling where interests would get behind their particular proposal. It's never just clean science. But in this case, it just seems to be that the capricious whim of a increasingly aged and opinionated old dude. So that's where we're at. I don't think we should. I think we're misleading people if we present it as a more rational process. That there are some reasonably smart people around him who could subsequently rationalize, sure, but I think we've lost any illusion that they're in control at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to emphasize this is not how policy normally gets made, right? I mean, that you would normally have, I guess, policy experts maybe offering their own autonomously, kind of devised proposals, maybe funneling it up the chain.
Yeah, you don't get there from here, right? If you start with tariffs framed the way the Trump administration has, there's no real way of reabsorbing it into a technocratic flow, whereas in the Biden case, it was long advertised, it was rationalized, it referred to existing practice in law, it was part of that whole familiar process of blob-style policymaking.
So we'll continue talking about tariffs in just a bit, but I wanted to ask about another story in the news. I feel like before we would have the space to dedicate more time to these kinds of issues, but obviously there's so much going on otherwise. But I didn't want to neglect the earthquake that happened in Myanmar this past week. Thousands died there, and obviously Myanmar is a country where there's been ongoing civil warfare for years. And I'm curious, how does earthquake relief in a context like that, I mean, how does it intersect with the government's, militarization and ongoing fighting in the country?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to comment, I think, on the strange way in which the current crisis in the US distorts all our perceptions. I think the vast majority of people, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, will have perceived the earthquake largely through extraordinary videos that were posted online, take your favorite social platform, of, I think, largely Thai skyscrapers that were shaking. Myanmar itself really would merit a segment, Cam, though it would stretch both of our our capacities to the limit. It has been, since its foundation, a kind of patchwork state, but since 2021 and the military takeover, convulsed by civil war, we're therefore in a media system which is under very tight control. Myanmar, insofar as you're within the government zone, is a country that has suffered rolling blackouts of the internet. We are very unlikely to know with any precision how many people died in this earthquake. The figures now are in the thousands. It will be surprising, I think, if they don't end up exceeding 10,000. So the country itself is being torn apart. The level of control and repression is such that there's very little credible evidence coming out in the midst of a crisis. The military have a track record in Myanmar of actually refusing aid from the outside in response to crisis. So both after the major cyclone in 2008 and after a major cyclone in 2023, the junta ostentatiously refused aid from the outside. So one of the most telling signals of the seriousness of the current situation is that the regime in the areas that it has controlled over has diverged from that practice, and actually said it would welcome support. But of course, the connections aren't there, the infrastructure isn't there, and this is happening at a moment when USAID, the largest global aid organization, is being gutted, and rather than phone calls going back and forth to Washington, organizing immediate relief, there's sort of silence on the line. And then finally, the point one would have to reckon with is that whatever relief is channeled into the force field of the civil war in Myanmar will, of course, be shaped by it. And already now, I gather, from what few reports we're getting from inside Myanmar, there is a marked divergence between towns, cities that are under the control of the military regime and those that aren't, in terms of the levels of relief that are available. So it's polycrisis. It really is the overlapping of multiple different crises in a single location. And Myanmar, as has been pointed out to me in a kind of, I think fair pushback, given our very intense focus on the Middle East, for instance, and Ukraine and Europe, it receives arguably, I think, even less attention than Sudan. So, in the kind of hierarchy of global crisis, it's probably in the fourth place, even though it has mega regional implications. So I think it would be a theme for us to return to, I think, gingerly and with all due modesty at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'd never quite explicitly articulated the hierarchy of crises out there, but there clearly is one in terms of the attention that they receive, which is not to say that's the attention they ought to receive. I am glad we got to talk a bit about Myanmar, and perhaps we will return to the subject, but I do want to turn to the main segment that we've prepared, and the data point there is 60%. That is the rate of tariffs that Donald Trump threatened during his last presidential campaign to impose on all Chinese goods coming into the United States.
We have tremendous economic power. And by the way, if we're not careful, we're not going to have that for long either. That's going to go down the tubes with everything else. But if China or some other country is behaving badly, we have things called tariffs that are so severe.
We're now waiting for Donald Trump to announce what the rates of tariffs will be on his so-called Liberation Day. But the run-up has raised all sorts of questions about whether, this will be the moment that an all-out trade war breaks out, specifically with China, America's major trading partner. There have been talks in the run-up to this tariff announcement with the trade representatives of both countries having met, and on the Chinese side, there was a quote to the effect that if the United States insists on damaging China's interests, China will resolutely counterattack. So we will wait to see what the response is, but it is fair to expect there will be some tariffs imposed on China, and the relationship will not be the same. And we thought we'd take an overall look at what the economic relationship is between the U.S. and China right now. So to start off with, I wanted to ask about overall sort of economic strategy right now in these two countries, specifically the role that science is playing in both countries, with the Trump administration, taking an approach to funding science that seems to be the opposite of China's focus on state-supported technological development. The United States right now is withdrawing support for science in various ways. And this is happening even as the United States government is clearly backed by the biggest tech companies. And so I'm curious how one would compare the philosophies at work here in terms of developing technology and the role of the government in supporting that. And, maybe unless philosophy is too kind of dignified a word to describe what the U.S. Role has been.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say I just can't bear to talk about the Trump administration anymore. And I'm totally with you. I think philosophy just... It dignifies this. If listeners are interested in my experience and my view on the situation of a leading U.S. institution of higher education and research, check out Chartbook newsletter. Let's talk about China. I mean, I think it's tempting to say that the Chinese regime does conventional industrial policy, conventional national strategy, following, if you like, as historians would say, in a trajectory that goes all the way back to the self-strengthening movement of the late 19th century, the late imperial stage, then by way of the Chinese Republic, and after the revolution before World War I. And then the communist regime inherits this and then builds systematically and with ever greater force since the period of reform on the idea that modern states differentiate themselves in terms of and compete in terms of technological industrial prowess. And that's obvious. And anyone who doesn't understand that is going to lose the race. And there's no ifs and buts about it. And you just power on down that line. And the difference with China is simply the scale. And it is staggering. So if you just take crude numbers of patent applications, which is a very crude indicator because of the quality of the patents and the degree to which they're cited. But, currently the Chinese annual rate of patent submission is 1.4 million plus a year compared to about 300,000 for the US. And it's something that's exploded in the last 10 years. So it's truly staggering. And any field of research right now, pretty much you will see the same thing. Obviously, there's dross. The Chinese education system is gigantic. There's huge competition, and the regime incentivizes academic publication in a way which is dangerous to quality and will lead to various types of scandalous forms of non-reproducible results, not to say cheating. But there's no denying, and anyone in any field of academic endeavor will tell you that there's just no denying the sheer scale and quality of the shift. But I think it's a little bit more interesting than that, because I think there's reason to think that in the same way as there are kind of powerful endogenous reasons why the Republican Party in the United States has gone from being the mainstream supporter of big science, which it was under Eisenhower in the 50s and still was through to the Reagan neoliberal period, there's endogenous reasons for why that's happened. Conversely, in the Chinese case, there are very powerful reasons why the CCP has become a centrally technocratic in its self-understanding. And this has to do with the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s, the great convulsion that shook the Maoist power system. And in the wake of that, as Chinese political elites tried to recover from the disorientation of that first assault of the politicization of culture and intellectual culture, the smashing of the research establishment in many Chinese universities, science and engineering emerged as the unpolitical ground on which everyone could agree. And so there's this phenomenon of the red engineer, who is often originally Moscow trained, but then increasingly within the Chinese system. These are the people, the graduates of Tsinghua University, China's MIT in Beijing, that sits alongside Beijing, Peking University, which is the more, if you like, traditional liberal arts political institution in Beijing, the May 4th University. So Tsinghua emerges as the center of technocratic expertise, and all the way down to Xi Jinping, but still under Xi Jinping as well. One of the routes to power in China was to combine an engineering degree with impeccable political credentials. And it's that really together that gives you the power. It's as though you took, in the US case, an engineering PhD followed by a JD. And then the JD would be your years done within the CCP cadre, working your way up. And those, if you look at the composition of the Chinese leadership at key moments since the era of reform began, it's not that they've been reading Milton Friedman and imbibing neoliberalism. These are true blue or true red, party adherents with a strong engineering background. And that's a key element. And then this is backed up very powerfully by the proclivities. It's not just a state rationale and a party rationale. It's backed up very powerfully by the proclivities of Chinese society. And if you look at the comparison of higher education university enrollment in India and China over the period since the 50s, there's an astonishing difference between the predominance of humanities and law type training in the Indian higher education system, which is also vast, and the Chinese system, where the emphasis is to a much higher degree on medicine and technology and engineering and math. And this then is also reflected in another part of the Chinese research complex, which is the private businesses. So Huawei, for instance, before it suffered the onslaught of the American government, was, I think, the number 3 or number 4 private funder of research in the world. It currently does about $23 billion worth of R&D every year. So that's like all of the grants given to Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia rolled together. So it's an incredible research complex. It's 23% of Huawei's turnover, revenue, not profit, turnover, that is plowed back into R&D. So they treat R&D more like a cost than an investment. It's just something they do at huge scale to continue being who they are. And so when you put those three things together, conventional national power policy, the internal logic of the party, and the drive within and the thrust within Chinese society at large, it's a very, very potent combination. And any university in the United States or anywhere else in the world can sing you a song of this, because by my latest estimation, 20% plus of the students on campus in Columbia are Chinese. If you add in the Asian American component, you're at more like 25%. And of the Chinese nationals registered with the immigration authorities, half are in the engineering school. And that's before you even get to the other bits of STEM. So the US science complex is itself benefiting from the spillover effects of this incredible drive by China. And that's what we then see in industrial policy, right? This isn't just an effect of coercion or limitless resources. It's also the brilliance of literally hundreds of thousands, millions of Chinese engineering minds being turned to lots of really hard problems.
So I want to turn to the state of the Chinese economy right now. I mean, in the run-up to this moment, or in the years prior to this moment, there was much talk about China's economy slowing down. But from what I can tell, the most recent indicators in the last few months are that Chinese economy is actually picking up. So what exactly is fueling China's economic recovery right now, if that's what's happening?
I think there's three ways of looking at this, and they're all, familiar kind of tropes from macroeconomics. One is that in a business cycle, a thing to look for is the moment when things stop getting worse. And by itself, that second order effect, so they don't need to get better, they just need to stop getting worse, generates, you find the bottom, if you like. And as soon as you find the bottom, this unleashes a series of decisions like, well, maybe I actually do need to renovate this apartment. Whilst property prices are crashing, it makes no sense to sink good money in a bad investment. Once property prices are stabilizing at their new low levels, all of a sudden a bunch of decisions become reasonable that over the preceding period from 2020-21 onwards were just dangerous to make. And China, in certain areas, hit bottom. And this was especially the case in the richer, more affluent real estate markets, where there has been a substantial turnaround. China is gigantic, 1.4 billion people. It has dozens of huge cities, bigger than most cities in the United States. And some of those are returning hotspots of property development and property prices. Large parts of the country are still stuck, but it's those new centers of growth which are driving things forward. So that's the second element of the story, which is, first of all, things stop getting worse, which by itself changes the incentives. And the second element is that we saw a shift in China's development path. And you can see this in the investment figures. It's not merely propaganda to talk about new quality productive forces. We're seeing it in the trade figures as well, which is that the Chinese industrial and economic growth that shaped the last 2 decades was in some ways just the first stage. And quite contrary to Western imaginings that it was ultimately us and our demand that was driving this, the principal demand was actually China's domestic urbanization that was driving this. 500 million people moved to the cities. Cities were massively transformed. That's what generated the growth. What we are now beginning to see is the shift of China towards the manufacturing sector. And in sector after sector, motor vehicles is simply the most dramatic one. China's manufacturing sector is taking over. Now, this is promising in terms of GDP growth. It poses a whole bunch of really interesting problems, which you and I should return to at a future point, which is the China shock that China itself is experiencing. In other words, these aren't necessarily high employment sectors, and an awful lot of Chinese firms are shifting production to lower cost areas, which aren't in China, but could be in Vietnam, or could even be further afield in Southeast Asia, if those places also enjoy access to American markets. And meanwhile, I think the third thing to think about here is whether China is really out of the woods yet. And with regard to this, the most worrying symptom is certainly that there seems to be continuing and ongoing deflation in many Chinese markets. That means falling prices. And if that were to propagate and to amplify, it would invalidate the first point, namely that things have stopped getting worse. Because a generalized deflation would be the next stage of a chronic contraction, which would really be a bad sign. And that is something to watch and to keep watching. But yes, it definitely does seem as though the first shock, the first wind down, the first contraction has to a degree ended.
We're going to take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about the U.S.-China economic relationship. So to shift now to America's new economic policy under the Trump administration, there's been a lot of talk about how this tariffs policy is pushing allies of various kinds to explore other possible relationships beyond the United States. You know, Europe is often mentioned in that context, but I wanted to ask specifically about what's happening in Asia, where China and South Korea and Japan have together announced an intention to jointly respond to U.S. tariffs. And I'm curious if this economic policy in Washington is really subverting then the broader goal of balancing against China in Asia in a foreign policy sense. I mean, in I guess a more general context, I mean, has America had any coherent economic policy for Asia ever since the demise of the TPP free trade agreement that collapsed a few years ago?
I think the short answer is that yes, this is counterproductive, and no, the United States does not have a coherent geopolitical, geoeconomic offering for Asia, and hasn't for many years, for more than a decade at this point. I mean, yes, the pressure from the United States, unsurprisingly, is driving China, South Korea, and Japan together. They held their first talks recently. The FP had a nice little snippet on it. The first talks they've had since 2019. But one shouldn't, I think, overemphasize the diplomatic element of this. Just look at the economic data, and what you'll discover is that the world economy doesn't actually revolve around the United States in most dimensions, certainly not with regard to physical trade and industrial production. It doesn't. America has a big trade deficit, which sucks in a lot of goods, and it's crucial to the dollar system's finances. But in terms of the flow of commodities and trade, Asia is the hub of this and has been for 15 years at least, since China's growth really took on huge scale. And so that goes on. It takes diplomatic form, it takes institutional form, and with the decision taken by Trump, but I think Hillary Clinton, if she'd been elected president, would also have made this decision. America's decision that there simply wasn't a domestic coalition available from the 2010s onwards. And so the stages of incoherence are essentially that you start with the vision TPP, which there isn't congressional backing for. It falls to Trump to abandon it. Then the Biden people come along and propose what is a coherent vision, but can't back it with resource. And now we're just back to full-on incoherence under Trump, with just a kind of bludgeoning trade policy, which doesn't seem to be coordinated with anything. The denouement of this sorry story is that Asia got on with doing the son of TPP, which was this mouthful. It's the CPTPP, which is Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So they nested the TPP within a comprehensive and progressive, offspring. And as that was originally conceived, it was conceived, certainly by the time the Americans got their hands on it, as a China containment policy. And now the latest question that Beijing is pushing is, hey, could we join? It's unlikely, I think, they're going to make much progress on this, because the South Koreans and the Japanese can see the Taiwanese problem coming, and the Taiwanese have preemptively also applied. So they've created this problem, and so everyone will shrink back from that. But the balance, if you like, of the historical direction of movement is not any longer towards a coherent American strategy of containment, but an AWOL, out of whack America that basically leaves a vacuum into which China then muscles in this new stage of its economic development, which is both threatening on the one hand because of its move into manufacturing, and on the other hand opens a whole new array of opportunities, because China will simply get richer and richer and richer, and ultimately that's what provides the markets for more and more sophisticated exports from the rest of the region. At least that would be the modified liberal fantasy of how this goes.
So I want to get to Taiwan in a second, but first I wanted to, I guess, ask about the U.S.-China relationship from the U.S. side. I mean, when there's talk of a trade war, it's always the U.S. agricultural sector that's said to be likely to suffer the most in the U.S. context. I mean, so what exactly explains this deep link between American farms and China?
So, I mean, what fundamentally connects the two is a logic of free trade and what that entanglement expresses. And it's large. China is the largest market for American agricultural exports. Soy, corn both go to China. It's worth maybe $35 billion, something like that, per annum. So it's a big flow. It didn't always used to be like that. In the age of Nixon and Kissinger was when the Chinese market opened up to American exports. What drives it is simply the disparity in what economists call factors of production, and in this case, the one that matters is land. So, the arable land per capita in China, that is the land that can be farmed, is about 0.08 hectares, which is about 800 square meters, which is a big back garden. Whereas in the United States, it's sixfold that. It's closer to 4,000, 5,000 square meters. And that ultimately is what determines the balance of production between the two sides in terms of per capita productivity. The United States will quite likely, as a result, come out ahead. Costs will be lower, production will be larger, and certainly for extensive crops like soy and corn, that huge territory, plus the sophistication, of course, of American agribusiness will tell. Why are the Chinese buying more food? Well, it's because as they get more affluent, the share of meat in their diet increases. And once you've got really big animal herds, you have to feed them. And the cheapest thing to do is to import somebody else's grain production. America is not China's favored supplier. America supplies about 15% of China's imports. So the trade with China is important for US agriculture. The trade with US agriculture is less important for China. Over the last 10 years, the share of Brazilian soy exports to the United States has doubled. So now the Brazilian share is about twice the size of the US share. So that's the knitting together of the two economies. And it's driven by a kind of a logic of factor abundance. It's a standing feature of America's history, right? That the agricultural sector has always been the sector which has the most profound structural interest in exports. It was true, of course, of the plantation economy, cotton economy, of course, with chattel slavery. But then the great development of American grain farming in the late 19th century, all of that drove an export-orientated, relatively free trade-orientated policy on the path of farmers. It's the opposite of what you see in Europe, because they're on the receiving end. Those are smaller, less competitive farms which need protectionism. Of course, American farmers like protectionism too, but very often that takes the form of, further support for their exports.
I guess to end this conversation, as I mentioned, I wanted to ask about Taiwan. As far as measuring these things go, it does seem like the risk of fighting over Taiwan seem to be rising. And I'm curious just how you'd even begin to evaluate what the economic fallout from a war over Taiwan, what that might be, and how should we think about that?
The escalation of tension certainly began in earnest under Trump won. It had been there with Hillary Clinton's pivot from 2011 onwards, but it really began to develop momentum in the Pentagon as they saw the end of Afghanistan and realized they needed to move away from the global war on terror. And the Trump administration, first time around, gave them ample support for that. But the escalation towards warfare around Taiwan and China really took place under the Biden administration. It's very important, I think, to drive this home. Of course, foreign policy in the United States is made by coalitions of different parties in the Senate. And so there is a very vociferous China hawk wing of the Republican Party in the Senate, and even more in the House, because the House is just generally more vociferous. But this was a bipartisan push, and it led to the balloon incident that was really the most dangerous escalation of tension between China and the US that we've seen in many, many years. That was over the winter of 2022 to 23, I think, right? Yeah. That was following Pelosi's ill-advised visit to Taiwan. And clearly there are people that are in that kind of mindset in the Trump camp. But so far, they've not manifested as dramatically as you'd expect altogether. Like Trump's policy on China has been relatively quiet by comparison with the aggressive moves to shift the terms of the debate around Ukraine and the, red-blooded, full-throated backing of Israel in the Middle East. And it's very telling that people like Elbridge Colby, who are in line for very senior strategic positions in American foreign policy and who are devoted, absolute China hawks, right, who have this mantra that defending American interests in East Asia is the one clearly identifiable priority of American policy as far as foreign policy is concerned, that everything else should be subordinated to that. their confirmation in Congress is actually being held up by folks in the Israel First camp, the anti-Iran Israel First camp, who actually think America has other priorities and the Middle East is the dominant one. So within the GOP, there are contending factions, and it's not clear that the anti-China wing is winning out. All the while, of course, the military apparatus in the US continues, I think, squarely to focus on the Chinese side, as you'd expect them to do, because that is the large war that they might be asked to fight. And they see, and it's difficult to filter this because who are we really as outsiders to judge? They point to the increasingly aggressive actions, which are undeniable, by the Chinese military forces around Taiwan, repeated incursions by both naval and air forces into to dangerous zones around Taiwan, the appearance of the Chinese Navy all over the Pacific. They point to these as symptoms of an escalation on the Chinese side, which the Americans claim points to the Chinese betting on or preparing themselves for aggression by 2027, maybe in 2027. And that then in turn justifies, of course, further spending and further preparation on the American side. So I would say that there are kind of three elements at work here. There is the very haphazard politics of the Trump coalition, which has many things on its mind. There is the bipartisan policy convergence in US, which has been going on for more than a decade, on China containment and China resisting China's rise. And then there is the narrowly military element, which is preparing and has to prepare. It's its job, after all, for large-scale confrontation, which then has its own timetables. And when those generals are crisped by Congress, they'll say, and they'll volunteer, our time horizon is 2027. And it's the interaction between those three things that we have to grasp to understand what's going on here. And then economists and business people look at this and go, what the hell am I supposed to do? How on earth do I compute this? What cost would it be reasonable to accept to disentangle my supply chain? And I think what you're seeing is folks basically tilting towards disentanglement. There's very little new foreign direct investment going on in China right now. There are explorations of new zones where you could build a supply chain for Apple, for instance, in India. But there's also a level of kind of suspended disbelief that folks can't really believe that we're taking this whole war over Taiwan thing seriously. And it's quite clear that in chunks of Washington, people are taking it deadly seriously. And no doubt in Beijing too. Let's be clear. This isn't a one-sided story. Beijing is a power state with huge ambitions. It wants regional hegemony, and it claims Taiwan. And there's no ambiguity about that. Whether or not they estimate that it's worth paying a very high price for pursuing that is a different matter. And that's all important, right? It's the difference between Russia being resentful over Ukraine and Putin launching an assault on Ukraine. Those are two different calculations. They're related to each other, but they're different, and the same is true on the Chinese side.
Yeah, well, clearly tensions increase as a result of these increase in tariffs. So we'll see whether a trade war has any bearing on actual war. But this conversation should end for now. We will be back next week, as always, with another data point. Ones and Twos is written and edited by Adam and me, and it is produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Twos listeners, including Edward Hobson, Bilal Abu Diab, Laurent Amard, Adrian Dietrich, Michael in Philadelphia, Jagdeep, Mary Boys, Narcissa, Richard S. in Tokyo, and Lars Honeytoast. I hope I pronounced those names right. Also, special thanks to Juho Juntila, a PhD student who tells his macroeconomics students to listen to Ones and Twos. Welcome, Juho students. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and